Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of How the Game Was Won. For today's episode, we're looking back to round 1 of the tournament played in Zurich, and today's game was played. The game I'm looking at today was played on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 2015. With the white pieces, we've got Caruana, and with the black pieces, Nakamura. And as I mentioned, it was round 1 of the classical games at Zurich. And without further ado, we can scan through the first couple of moves, and as you can see, it's a Sicilian Najdorfs variation, and we get to move 7 for black, which is h5, which seems to be the evolution of chess these days, because h5 in a way helps defend d5 by d5 by preventing black from playing by preventing white from coming in with, for instance, playing g4 and follow that by g5 and displace the knight, thereby creating the d5 weakness. So by playing h5, it prevents that entire sequence of moves. However, at the same time, you have to remember that as a general rule, when it comes to pawn pushes, every time you push a pawn, you tend to create a weakness behind the pawn. And in this case, you've got a potential weakness developing at g6, which is no longer able to be protected by the pawn when it was sitting at h7, which then in turn could create a problem when it comes to kingside castling at a later stage. But without further ado, let's see how the game continued with g3, knight bd7, bishop g5, bishop e7, a4, knight c5, bishop d2, bishop e6, and a5. Now, at the moment, white is developing a nice bind on both d5 as well as on b6, and which means that black will need to break out of it with possibly a suboptimal pawn push, which is exactly what he does now with b5, which obviously means that we've got an en passant of a takes b6 and queen takes, which now leaves white with these two b and c pawns that could potentially create some problems running down the b and c files, because their path to the queen squares at the moment unhindered. Game continues with d3, castle short. Again, as I mentioned here, with black castling short, there is this yawning chasm of a gap sitting here at h7, which needs to obviously be dealt with. a5, queen d2. Now, at the moment, as white, Caruana's position seems to be slightly more pleasant. He's got some decent pressure happening against that d6 square that I talked about, and which is more valuable than black's potential pressure along the queen side once he's able to break through, with, say, pushing to a4. Game continues with rook f to c8, rook f to d1, and there's the a4 push. And the pawn sacrifice effectively clears away the c4 square for his bishop to be able to come into. And once he's got his bishop there, he's got some really useful pressure running along this f1 to a6 diagonal. However, it's not immediately obvious how Nakamura will recover the pawn, but maybe the pressure that he develops along with his strongly placed bishop will allow him to recapture the pawn at a later stage with still maintaining some sort of advantage. And obviously Caruana picks up the pawn, bishop comes into c4, and now white comes with a5, which is a nice solution because effectively now the pawn is still untouchable, and what's more, from Caruana's point of view, he's got the nicely placed rook, which gives useful support to that pawn pushing up the a5. Game continues queen d8, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, queen takes d6, queen takes d6, rook takes, knight b7, rook d2, rook a5, rook b1, and knight c5. Now at the moment you can see that black is obviously still down the pawn, but he retains some sort of compensation by way of this really nicely placed bishop. His pieces are nicely active, and white's position is becoming slightly more awkward than what it was before. So now we continue with knight d5, bishop d8, h4, rook a3, knight e to c1, rook c to a8, doubling up the rooks of the a file and putting some nice pressure onto that a2 square. So that means that if black can do something to, say for instance, displace the knight sitting at c2, sorry c3, then that a2 square becomes a really useful point at which to be able to get into behind white's defenses. We continue with rook and d to d8, bishop a5, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to put pressure down onto that knight. Now the knight comes up to b5, and so steadily white is beginning to try and make progress. These knights are trying to get into more active squares to be able to apply some decent pressure. Black, on the other hand, has not created any immediate threats. However, as I mentioned earlier, he's got this useful diagonal for the light square bishop combined with another useful diagonal for the dark square bishop. And once he gets the dark square bishop moved a little bit closer, we'll then be able to re-link up these two rooks running up towards that a2 square. So there are some potentials, but there are no immediate threats. And black goes straight away to a2 with the rook now that the knight has vacated that c3 square. We've got bishop f3, g6, and knight to e7 check. Instead of knight to e7 check, Caruana could have gone knight d6 for instance and played bishop d5, rook d5, rook c2, and rook a1, which, and this nice little detail, could have led to a position where white could potentially force the win. Black has great chances to hold the position, but with the e5 pawn effectively hanging, there's some pressure down the A file is not an easy and practical task to be able to achieve. However, as I mentioned, Caruana went knight to E7, which allowed King G7, Knight C6, Knight A4, Knight D6, Bishop E6, and Rook B7, followed by Rook C2. Now, in this position, Caruana should have potentially gone with Knight taking on F7, with Bishop takes F7, Knight takes on E5, Rook F8, Rook D to D7, and it gives Black a better position. However, he went for Knight taking on E5 straight away, which allowed this brilliant reply by Nakamura by playing Knight C5 and Rook E7. Now, the problem with Caruana's solution to the situation is that with this position, the rook that is now sitting on E7 is starting to look really, really uncomfortable and is starting to rapidly run out of potential flight squares. So, with King F8, Caruana could have continued, for instance, with Rook E6, Knight takes, Knight and D takes on F7, Bishop C3, Knight H8, and there's some degree of counterplay. However, he went with again with the dubious move of Knight to C6, and Black comes back with Knight D3. And suddenly, Black has created a really, really, really decent threat over here. Obviously, you can see that Bishop to B6 is coming up, and after Bishop to B6, there's that really brilliant. Let me just make correct the direction of the arrow here. That arrow should be pointing at the king rather, not at G2 square. My arrow is slightly out of alignment there, but it's a decent threat coming to B6 with the direct line down into the G1 square where the king is sitting, and also the knight that is sitting on C6 is at the moment currently hanging, which will be yet another problem for us to be able to deal with. So we continued with E5. The bishop comes back to B6, as we said, which gives the distinct advantage to Black. Here again, White could have come back with Rook takes an E6, F takes E6, Knight D4, Bishop D4, Bishop A8, Bishop F2, King G2, Bishop D4 with check, King E3, Bishop E5, and Black is still better, but it's definitely still very much far from winning. So, getting back to the game at hand, so instead of playing that, Caruana comes back with Rook to B7, which just simply allows Black to immediately play Bishop to takes an F2 with check. Here, for instance, White could have played King H1, but then Bishop takes on G3 is still winning for Black, with the strongly doubled up bishops running down onto the king's side. But instead of doing that, Caruana continued with King to G2, and that just simply allowed the bishop to come back to C5 with a discovered check. The king went back to H1, and now doubling up the rooks on the second rank with rook on A up to A2, and it's now obvious that Black has nowhere near a perpetual check, and it is in very short succession that white is going to be checkmated on the h2 square. So without allowing his suffering to continue for any much longer in this position, Caruana resigned, and Nakamura picked up the lead in the tournament after the very first game, with the other two games in the tournament in round one of the classical both being draws. So that is how the game was won. Post your comments and questions down below. Don't forget to share this out amongst your chess friends. If you like this style of video presentation, give this video a thumbs up. If you don't like it at all, give it a thumbs down. That way I've got a clear indication of what type of content to be giving you in the future. And last but by no means least, click that big red subscribe button just below the video screen. That way you can stay subscribed to my channel and receive notifications when I post each and every single new one of these how the game was won analysis on YouTube on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Stay carved up for the win out there. I'll see you next time. Cheers.